Good evening. I'm Kimberly Eisen Simmons, Interim Director of the Institute for African American Research and Associate Professor of Anthropology and African American Studies. I would like to welcome you all to tonight's event, Hurricane Katrina and the artwork of JRenee, Race, Injustice, and Memories of Home. This event is part of the Justice Themed Semester, sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences here at the University of South Carolina. This event will pay tribute to the people and culture of New Orleans, 15 years after Hurricane Katrina, discuss race and injustice, and contemplate memories of home with artist JRenee. For many of us, as we think about the images associated with Hurricane Katrina, we recall the destruction and devastation, human suffering, loss of homes and personal possessions, displacement, and the loss of life. During Hurricane Katrina, we witnessed environmental injustice, with some African American communities literally living on toxic landfills, with their circumstances made worse when the levees broke. We witnessed slow rescue and recovery efforts. We saw people trapped in their homes, some being rescued from their rooftops, people wading through contaminated water, people struggling for resources and survival, people struggling to rebuild. We saw how Black people in New Orleans were disproportionately impacted by the effects of Hurricane Katrina. Race and class were on display, along with justice and injustice. It is reported that more than 1 million people left New Orleans. People who left during this time were referred to as Hurricane Katrina evacuees. Many people who left New Orleans came to Columbia, South Carolina, and continue to reside here. In New Orleans, 15 years later, we see a new New Orleans. We see gentrification and other changes. As we reflect tonight and think about these issues and circumstances, let's also think about people coming together, the ongoing recovery process, rebuilding and reconnecting with people and places, strength and resilience, culture and traditions, and resettlement in terms of memory, new and changing forms of community, and our ideas of home. Again, welcome. It's great to have you all here with us tonight. This event will be moderated by, I'll help moderate it, and also Amber Domain, one of our graduate students in linguistic anthropology in the Department of Anthropology. She's from New Orleans. And we would like to welcome JRenee. She's a friend of the university and of the Institute. And we'll do formal introductions in a few minutes. First, we'd like to start with a video that was made 5 years ago. It's an ABC News video clip by Robin Roberts. And I'd just like to say that it does have some disturbing images because they go back and they have actual footage from Hurricane Katrina, from the Superdome, from the flooding. And so some of the images are distressing. We leave with that just to remind ourselves of what Hurricane Katrina was really like, what the impact was, and what we're actually looking at tonight in terms of the moment, moving forward, and thinking about where we are right now. So with that, we'll start the video.
Tonight, out of darkness and despair.
My heart was broken. God, Lord Jesus.
A new perspective on the most destructive storm in U.S. history.
I had to do something. I wasn't going to leave them there.
Harrowing stories it took 10 years to tell.
I saw a weird acceptance in his eyes that really unnerved me.
And stories that hit close to home.
For about, 24 to 48 hours, you didn't know if Mom and I were even alive.
Join us on a remarkable journey of renewal.
We will always fight to keep what makes New Orleans great alive.
Redemption.
New Orleans Saints, Super Bowl champs.
I needed somebody to believe in me just as much as New Orleans needed someone to believe in them.
And
Resilience. That's what I'm talking about.
Now I'm crying.
Katrina, 10 years after the storm. You think about food and music when you come to the Gulf Coast, Cajun and Creole cooking. Mississippi's soulful Delta blues, and the swinging jazz of New Orleans. Yet even now, 10 years after Katrina, there's something else you can't help but think about when you're here. In the aftermath of the storm, the music of everyday life just disappeared.
It was still. There was not even a seagull. It was very ominous.
There was nothing, no birds, no cats, no dogs. And I'll never forget that.
And for all of that to be gone, you never understand it until you miss it.
But before that eerie silence, there was the unforgettable, angry howl of the massive hurricane as it cut a wide swath of destruction across the Gulf Coast. Katrina strengthened into a hurricane on August 25, 2005. And as it gained force over the warm Gulf waters, it was quickly predicted to become a catastrophic event.
My fear is absolutely that the models are correct.
It is gaining strength again. It is now stalking the Gulf Coast.
It rapidly doubled in size and intensified into a Category 5 hurricane.
This is a terrible storm. Take this seriously.
Across Louisiana and Mississippi, there were urgent orders to evacuate.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a test.
From the Texas coast to the Florida panhandle, millions braced for the worst. Those who couldn't evacuate or wouldn't hunkered down.
We love y'all, and we're gonna make it.
Or took refuge at a shelter of last resort.
Already hundreds of people have made their way to the Superdome, driving cars, walking, taking buses.
On August 29th, Katrina made landfall as a Category 3 hurricane, still packing deadly winds as strong as 125 miles per hour.
The storm has come ashore this morning, coming in over Grand Isle, Louisiana.
We got hit with a piece of debris, took out the window in our vehicle.
For hours, the coast was under assault. When it was over, Katrina's fierce winds and near-record storm surge had gone from natural disaster to national tragedy. Places like Slidell, Louisiana, just outside of New Orleans, suffered catastrophic damage.
In New Orleans, we have a major American city underwater. Major levees broke and slowly the city has filled with water. The city is going to be essentially uninhabitable for many days.
We were hearing rumors that the lower Ninth Ward might be flooding, and the first thing that I saw was this house.
Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist Ted Jackson ignored his newspaper's evacuation orders and commandeered a small boat to photograph the storm for the Times-Picayune.
There was a family on the porch that was desperate, with water up to their chest. Above the roar of the hurricane and the bands of the rain that kept slapping us, they were screaming to me for help.
80% of New Orleans flooded after the levees failed. Neighborhoods like St. Bernard Parish completely submerged, leaving people trapped, isolated, asking, where is the help? When is it coming? At the convention center, an estimated 25,000 people showed up, only to find out it wasn't an official place for evacuation.
We need help.
So they were left stranded.
And it can't give us a bottle of water for 1,000.
Some left to die.
Inside the convention center, there were 5 bodies that I saw. Outside, there was one in a wheelchair that people had tried to respectfully cover with a blanket. I was grabbed by the elbow by a woman named Angela Perkins. She just started screaming, and she said, help us, please. And at that point is when she dropped down to her knees and just screamed.
And while some people blame the government for failing as badly as the levees, one federal agency was hailed as being heroic, the U.S. Coast Guard, credited with rescuing more than 30,000 people. What stands out 10 years later is how much has been rebuilt.
It's great to see the homes, but being from this area, I know what's still missing.
And you can see why, after the levees failed with more than 50 breaches, how water would just pour into the city, leaving an estimated 60,000 people trapped for days.
I think most of America, most of the world, remembers those images of people on the rooftop trying to make signs. What was it like to the rooftops and see people in such a state of desperation?
Sometimes when you got down there, they were crying because they wanted to leave so bad. Sometimes they were just jumping up and down for joy because they wanted to get out. Sometimes they were so dehydrated and beat down that they could barely even walk to get to the position that they needed to be to get hoisted up, and you had to physically help them to get into the basket because they were just so tired and exhausted. But my disposition was to pick the women and children up first.
One of those children, 15-year-old Serena Johnson, now 25. She and her family sought safety on the roof of this house.
We all wanted help. That's all we wanted was help, and nobody came to our aid for a long time. And that's what makes me mad.
3 days passed. Serena and her parents were stranded in the unbearable heat. And then, just as things were getting really precarious, they caught the attention of a Coast Guard helicopter.
At that point, you were out of food, out of water.
We was getting close to being completely out of everything. So it was like they came at the right time.
So what was that moment like when you knew that that helicopter was coming for you? This was your way out.
I remember it vividly when it happened. As I'm going up into the air, and we went spinning. We went spiraling up into the helicopter. I had packed a little mesh book bag, just with a couple of things, just in case we had got out. But when the helicopter came, the propeller winds were so strong, it opened up my bag and all of my clothes fell into the water. I can't see no cars. It was like just dropping into a swamp. I think they took my mom in second. They took me in first. And then we left, like, without my dad.
Dad was still on the roof?
Coming up, the heart-stopping video of a hero rescuer as Katrina makes a direct hit in Mississippi.
We're driving the boat down the highway. I had to do something. I wasn't going to leave them there.
And a dramatic survival story.
It's surreal. It's just totally surreal.
It took one woman 10 years to tell.
You're looking at it, you're acknowledging it, but it doesn't seem real.
Plus, Serena's life blown by the storm in an unexpected direction.
I've been through a lot. I'm speaking the truth.
And later, a personal homecoming when we return.
Okay. And again, that was part one of Robin Roberts' special. Those images were very difficult to watch, I know, as we think back on Hurricane Katrina 15 years ago. Let's go ahead and move into the part of the program where JRenee and Amber both think about their own personal reflections and growing up in New Orleans and what New Orleans meant to them and continues to mean today. And they'll also think about Hurricane Katrina and what their lives have been like since then. So I would love to introduce JRenee to everyone right now. She's internationally renowned for her reverse glass work, and she's from New Orleans. She attended Xavier University, where she was an art major. She relocated to Columbia after Hurricane Katrina, and she resides here with her family in the area. And Amber Domain is a doctoral student in linguistic anthropology in the Department of Anthropology here at the university. She's also from New Orleans. She also attended Xavier University, and she will share her experiences here tonight as well. So I hand the microphone literally over to the two of them. Amber, Okay.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. So I'll just share a little bit of what my experience with Hurricane Katrina was. And so I was 10 years old when Katrina hit. I evacuated. I was privileged enough to be able to with my family. So I have two sisters. I was living with both my parents at the time, and my one set of my grandparents came with us. So there were 7 of us total who drove out of New Orleans. But because my whole family is so grounded in New Orleans, it was the 7 of us plus like a caravan of maybe like 2 other cars of family members. We tried to stay together as long as we could to evacuate to the same places. I remember my biggest concern at 10 years old when we were evacuating, we had done this a number of times before, but I remember arguing with my mom like the night before we left because I was like, should I leave my stuff on the ground? What if the house floods? And then she was like, okay, well, we'll put it like on the dressers. And then I was like, but what if like the roof comes in? And then we eventually compromised on me putting my belongings on the bed, which didn't end up mattering because our house did flood about a foot. But because there was so much water in the city and because people couldn't get into the city for so long afterwards, the mold in the house went up to the ceiling and we lost everything. So the things that we evacuated with were the things that we had for the months that came afterwards. And I remember when we evacuated, it wasn't like we went to one place and then we like settled there and that was it. I think first we went to Arkansas and we were staying in hotel rooms and we saw a lot of the images like you all saw in that video. And then I think we went to Tennessee. And again, because my family is so grounded in New Orleans, our closest family was probably in like Las Vegas or California. So it wasn't anywhere we could easily drive to as a family. So we were just kind of hopping around and we eventually landed in Houston, where it took a little while, maybe a few weeks, maybe a month. I don't know. My sense of time at that point in my life is very off, but it felt like a really long time that we weren't in school, which was really significant for me because it was supposed to be my first year of middle school, which I was really excited about. And in New Orleans, we'd probably gone to school for maybe like a week or two. And it was like a really big class, like a lot of hustle and bustle. And then when we got to Houston, we were in Catholic school, and which is pretty traditional in New Orleans. When we got to Houston, we ended up enrolling in Lutheran school because the Catholic schools wouldn't allow us late into the school year. And so that was a bit of like culture shock for me. And then the class sizes were a lot smaller. And we stayed in Houston for maybe 4 months, I think. So I don't know, maybe like August or September until December, January. And then during that time, my dad was working for UPS, and they were one of the companies that was able to like get into the city. And so my dad was able to keep his job, but he was commuting back and forth between Houston and New Orleans. And thankfully, my grandparents were able to take care of me and my sisters. We're all 2 years apart, so we were all pretty young at the time. And while my parents went like over on the weekends to go check on the house and try to, get like little like pictures and different like trinkets and things, but like the majority of our belongings were destroyed. And so we had to build from scratch. But I will say that we were privileged, lucky, and blessed in that my grandparents' house was still standing. My dad always says that when he got back from Katrina, he thought he could just flip on a light switch because everything was just totally normal still. But of course, there was no energy or power in the city. And so we were able to move back there in January and go back to school where we originally were going to school, but the class sizes, it was like a fourth of the students that were there before. I remember we had a lot of family discussions about whether we wanted to stay in Houston or whether we wanted to go back. And me and my sisters like butted heads about this a little bit, but for me, I really wanted to go back home. I wanted to see all my friends, and that's what we ended up doing, but it did look really different once we got back. The school had like our campus was still intact, but a lot of other campuses weren't up and running. So we had students from other spots that used to be like rivals, like now in the same classrooms as us, and learning those kinds of dynamics in like middle school was challenging. And so I remember so we went to school in Lakeview, which is a predominantly white area of New Orleans, but I was raised in New Orleans East, which is a predominantly Black part of the city. And those kinds of like unofficial sorts of like segregations like in the city were always like really clear to me. And as I got older, they became clearer and clearer as like we started to see different parts of the city come back faster than others after the storm, and see kind of where like different resources were allocated and the groups of people that were sort of like highlighted. And so it became really clear to me that there were certain things that I didn't have, whereas like my peers did. And those things, again, became clearer and clearer as I grew up. I really like this image of Xavier that's up right now. JRenee will speak a little bit about her experience as well, but I didn't go to Xavier until, obviously, I'm pretty young. I graduated in 2017 from Xavier, so I didn't know much about it before before being on campus as a undergrad. But I'm a third year legacy. Xavier's the only Catholic HBCU in the entire United States. HBCU, it stands for Historically Black College or University. And so I'm very proud of that. My grandmother graduated from Xavier, with a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. My parents went to Xavier, and I was fortunate enough to be able to graduate. But I really like this image because the arc that's there was actually built in 2017, so right when I was graduating. And this kind of shows not just like the destruction that we saw at the beginning, but also how different parts of the city sort of came back better and stronger. So Xavier is an institution that was around before Katrina and continues to graduate strong Black students, if I do say so myself, to this day. So I'll go ahead and pass it off to JRenee to be able to talk about your experience now.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm JRenee. And yes, we picked Xavier University because that is the reason why I ended up coming back to New Orleans. I was born in New Orleans, and my parents actually, after graduating from Xavier University, and that's a picture of both of them when they were dating and attending Xavier University. I was in this, after they were married, because my mother graduated earlier than my father. They had me in the 66 yearbook. And so we moved to Memphis, where my father is originally from, even though he has roots in New Orleans. His grandmother and great-grandmother were born in Algiers. And they lived actually off of Claiborne, when there were just beautiful trees like St. Charles. Right now they have an expressway that they put through the city. But before that, there were beautiful, beautiful trees that lined Claiborne, and they lived around the corner from Circle Food Store. So they were married, and they had me, and they stayed a couple of years and moved to Memphis, where I grew up. But I came back to attend Xavier University, and I graduated there with a BA in art. And that's how I ended up staying, because I fell in love with my city of birth. And I was there 25 years until Hurricane Katrina. So I guess the reflection part, I can say this. I think as a New Orleanian and being there for so long, and both my kids were born there as well, you never think that something like this would have happened to the city, where we wouldn't be able, the resources weren't there for our people to come back. Like, people who had roots there, people who live there, people who love the city, who understand the culture. And I, at the time, had a gallery boutique on Iberville, one block off of Canal Street. And the reason why I got stuck there, because a lot of people ask me, well, why didn't you leave? Well, my car was there, but I was in the process of trying to get all of the people who worked for me paid. Vendors needed money to get out, because we didn't really realize that it was going to be that bad, where there were no hotels you can stay in. You really had to get out of there. And I was trying to accommodate all of my vendors and my employees, and take care of packing things and finding out if the landlord was going to board my building, which I was renting in the French Quarter. And then also I was purchasing a home, and But where I was living at the time, renting, my landlord was an elderly woman, and I was trying to find out if she was going to board or if I needed to board. So it was a lot of things going on that led up to me actually deciding with my 2 kids, my mother who had just moved the year before, and my niece who was visiting from Washington, D.C. For the summer, well, we need to leave. And when I called for my car, because my car wasn't there, was at a friend's house, they had already left with their family and whoever they could pack to Atlanta, and my keys were in their car and my car was in New Orleans. So to make a long story short, that's how I got stuck there. And that's how easy you could get stuck in a situation. And I couldn't find a car to rent. And even if I did find a car to rent, the gas trucks weren't coming into New Orleans to fill up the gas tanks. So we may be on the side of the road. So we had to make a decision, you know, whether we're going to stay, split up the family and go with people who had 1 or 2 seats in their car. And we made the decision to stay. And we left about maybe 4 days afterwards. It was a horrible experience. I can go into all those stories. It were good things, bad things. But for the most part, the police, when we saw the police, they were sending us, they wouldn't let us go back to where we were staying at a friend's house. It flooded, but it was 9 feet above ground. So before you got to the first floor, and then it was the second floor. Now they weren't there. They left keys for anyone who needed a place, which was a blessing in disguise. But it was difficult because there was water everywhere, and we had to go through the water, which was up to our neck, to get to the quarter to try and get out. And then when we got there, the police said we had to go to the convention center. But there was something in their eyes that wasn't right, because I guess they could tell the way we had managed our water and our food that we still were in decent spirits, even though we were drained and had, you know, heat flashes, and I didn't get any sleep. And a gentleman overheard us having a conversation. I called him my guardian angel. His name is Wardell. If he's anywhere in the world, may he be completely blessed. He was a contractor in the city, 6 feet something, and overheard the conversation with the police and said, you guys can't go there. And he told us how bad it was. And if you remember what we just saw, what was going on at the convention center, he's like, there's no food, no water, we don't know when they're going to come and get us. And he said, but my truck was acting up. I think I fixed it. If you all don't mind being in the back of the truck, and maybe the kids and the baby, because my daughter wasn't even 2 years old. He said, I could take your mom and the kids in the front. I drive you guys out. And the police turned and looked at us and said, if I were you, I'd go with them. And this was a complete stranger. So I said, well, if the police said to go with a complete stranger, we're going. And that's how we escaped New Orleans. But it was bad because we had to pass by the convention center to go across to Algiers in order to leave. And you could see all the people. And we were the only vehicle on the street. And people were literally running in the rain towards our vehicle. And that's when it hit me how just devastating it was. Because and it was my first time to really be sad, because I had to be strong for my family through the storm, which was horrible. They said 4 hours. That was 4 hours, probably 4 to 5 hours of work part, but it was about a 9-hour, event. And got with friends, family. There was a lot of sharing stories with people who were in Houston, and we stayed one night in Lake Charles before that, and we ended up getting train tickets from generous people, and we went back to DC because my niece was visiting for the summer, and they wouldn't switch her ticket out. She was supposed to fly out Monday when the hurricane was hitting, and we couldn't get her ticket switched, so we had nothing else to do but figure it out. And we ended up going to DC with my sister and stay with family. And 4 years later, we moved to South Carolina, where I am here now, because my mother's roots are from South Carolina. And that's basically it. And I chose this picture as well because it is the beginning of my homecoming and everything that influenced my artwork. And I thought that was important, since we were going to be talking about the hurricane series that I created while I was in Washington, D.C. and finished when I came to South Carolina. And now we'll turn it over to Dr. Simmons.
Great.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, JRenee and Amber. If anyone has a question, please go ahead and type your question in the Q&A box, and we're going to have time in a little bit here after JRenee presents her artwork here in the Katrina series for Q&A. Oh, and this section here, this section, as y'all will see, is divided up into different parts where JRenee would discuss individual pieces here. So JRenee, I'll pass it back to you for you to go ahead and talk about the wonderful work you've done in this series.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I feel very privileged to be a part of this this program. So the first piece, I think it's coming up. So this is Oshun Rising. Okay, and this piece is one of two, well, really one of five, but two of the hurricane pieces that's in the permanent collection of the McKenna Museum in New Orleans. It's also a great place to see a lot of wonderful African-American artists. And this particular piece, which was on the invitation, I was happy that Dr. Simmons picked this piece because it embodies all the different things, the destruction of what Hurricane Katrina did, but also to the city, but also it reflects the arts. New Orleans, if no one has been to New Orleans, I feel sorry that you didn't see it before Hurricane Katrina. I mean, it's nice to visit now, but before Hurricane Katrina, pre-Katrina, it was very in its most authentic and raw state. We call New Orleans the Big Easy, and it was because it was easy living, great food at a very reasonable price. People don't have to drive. That's another reason why a lot of people stayed, because a lot of people never had to drive and didn't have cars. And but there's always something about New Orleans that pleased the senses. Like if you think of a city that it pleases all five of your senses, is New Orleans. Taste, the food, sounds, the music, the jazz, the tapping in the French Quarter, you know, people having great conversations, a certain type of dialect that's similar to the Gullah language, where it's very Caribbean flowing. You know, if you speak with people from New Orleans, it sounds different. You know, they're loud, they hug, they kiss. That's the kind of French and Spanish influence, the kissing on both cheeks and the hugging, and the music and the food and the smells, walking through there, all the wonderful smells, and of course the heat. So Oshun, which is a religious symbol, Orisha they call them, and that came through the diaspora of Africa and hit all of the Caribbean and New Orleans, and through the slaves and their religion, it was not allowed to practice any, the slaves couldn't practice any of their traditional religion. But in New Orleans, under the French and Spanish, and basically the French, because they occupied New Orleans first and for the longest time, they allowed the slaves and free people of color to gather at Congo Square. And if anyone knows what Congo Square is, it is the place and the birthplace of jazz. It's named after Louis Armstrong. They call it Louis Armstrong Park, but it's the one area that's right next to the French Quarter, where all the African traditions, they were able to gather once a week, which was Sunday, and practice drumming, their music. They could speak their traditional language. They, after a while, it started becoming a meeting in a marketplace for ideas and business, but mostly it was drumming. And that's where the birthplace of jazz is. It's the drumming of the Congo, which comes from the Congo of Africa, the Afro drums that created the riffs for jazz. So there's art all around in New Orleans that's still prevalent, you know, today, but mostly a living experience in New Orleans, and it's specifically this area, which is called the Treme. So Oshun is the Orisha of beauty, art, love. And so in this piece, her colors are yellow and orange, and you see this face that's purple and blue, which represent two other Orishas, female Orishas. And one is the beautiful purple color, which is Oya, who is the destroyer. They say Oya is the one who came through it and had the earthquakes in Haiti, because she destroys and then she rebuilds, and she destroys and demolishes. So that's why her face is purple on one side, and then she almost turns into, not really, I don't want to say a monster, the different color eye, which you'll see in some of my work. There's a reason for that, and I'll explain that later, but it's like the third eye, people who see the future. And the blue color is more of a Yemaya, the mother of fertility. Well, the story goes that Yemaya, who is Orisha as well, her colors are blue. She represents the ocean and the water, but she loves her children so much. Some of them she loves so much that they drown. So because of what was going on during the storm with the drowning and the destruction, and the only person who really paid attention to it, the people who were above ground seeing it, that's what this piece represents. It's a changing of the guard almost from one Orisha to the next. And New Orleans being a Catholic city, which goes back to Xavier University because of the French and the Spanish influence, the Orishas were similar to some of the saints in Catholicism, so they hid them under the saints. So that's another reason why when they talk about voodoo or vodou, it's still prevalent today, because they allowed, it's the only place in the South that they allowed the practice of the African religious traditions once a week in Congo Square. So that's this piece. Also, you see the little king cake babies in the peacock feathers, which peacock feathers are usually a man's role, but that energy is that for Oya. And I put the king cake babies because they represent what we have in our cakes during Mardi Gras, but it's supposed to represent the baby Jesus. And that's why it's like hidden under Catholicism. And that's why I put those in there. So they're actually real little chocolate king cake babies on the glass. Next slide, please. Okay, this is another one that's very much has to do with the Treme. I lived in the historic Treme for right there at Barracks and St. Claude, which is now they've changed the name to, I think, Henrietta de Lille, the nun. They're thinking about, she organized the first Haitian group of nuns that would allow slaves and free people of color and Africans and non-Africans and people of color, Creoles of color, went to the church, St. Augustine Church, which was a block away from my residence. And so all of the jazz funerals and second lines would come through the neighborhood, because that particular neighborhood, before it's changed so much now, they had original juke joints throughout the area. So they passed through, and one of them is the Little People's Place, which was, I could see it from my door, but it was right around the corner. And for us, the second lines and jazz funerals, which are music bands consisting of like tuba, jazz, trombones, saxophones, and they're the first line. So when you say the second line, it's all the people who come in out of their homes. They either start with the band, but it picks up with people. They either join the band and they go throughout the neighborhoods. You don't really know where you're going, but you go and you stop at the juke joints and for water or whatever. And then the jazz funerals are the same, except for they go to the funerals. They go to the funeral grounds. And this piece is a piece dedicated to that. It flows through you, means it goes through your spirit and your soul, because either you want to dance and you want to join, or you want to come out and just watch them pass, and it gives you a different spirit. It's the only place in the country that this happens. And so you see the woman with the flowers. When you go to the funeral grounds, a lot of times they'll pass flowers out as they go to finally bury someone who has been carried all throughout the city in different areas to the burial ground. So this is one of my favorite pieces. Next slide, please. This is another one. We tried to get all the ones that dealt with, all the paintings that dealt with our feelings. And I think out of all of the collection, and this is one in a collection in New Orleans, Evicted was, it says it is what it is right now. You see the bus transfer. I collected when I was in Washington, D.C. Riding the bus in Washington, D.C. was probably the most entertaining, exhausting, and also let's say there was tons of characters there. There was a lot of experiences. I can't go into them, but I collected the bus transfers because I knew I was going to want to do some artwork with them. This particular piece was great because I wanted to put it in the door, because that's where I ended up having to be and try and regroup my life. What do you do after you lose everything? What do you do when there's no one visiting the city anymore and you had a business there and that was your source of income? What do you do when your house is flooded or catches on fire? And the house I was buying, they ended up by getting my money back, but I was interested in all kinds of destruction happened. So for everyone, this piece with the markings on the door, I did the building like a patchwork quilt because it was the symbol of sewing your life back together. But more importantly, it was also about the government and how, first of all, they didn't do right by the New Orleanians there and people in Louisiana, because any Mississippi, we have to put them in there too. I didn't live in Mississippi, but I know that in New Orleans, people weren't really allowed to come back. They didn't know what to do, and I understand that because it was so catastrophic. But this particular piece says it all. It was like one way out. So that's why you see the one-way sign and no road to come back home. And then when you get home, you have all this stuff. So you see this I found that old clipping of the Indian being attacked by the cowboy, taken out of the land, like the Trail of Tears. And the American flag, which is unfortunate, is under all the rubble because they didn't do right by the citizens. So this piece says a lot. And I know that when a lot of New Orleanians had seen this piece, they really, really, appreciated it and told me in so many words that they appreciated it because it really says everything about the events during and after post-Katrina and how people were feeling. And so you see him smoking, just trying to take it all in and figure out, basically where we're going from there. Next slide, please. So this was a commission, actually, one of my collectors, and it's unfortunate we didn't put the name on there because I could not remember the name. I'm sorry about that. But I had another transom window that I did, and she wanted a piece done from my personal experience. And there were, the news showed a lot of bad things, and there were a lot of bad things, but I want people to know also that there were a lot of people helping people. There were a lot of people being generous and kind and trying, everybody wasn't, in the stores stealing or looting. It was a lot more probably kind things than anything else. This particular piece is nice because you see the people sad, you see the expression, you see them looking, you see the water coming, and the sun is going down. And this was my experience of one of the positive things that I experienced, if you could find positivity. Well, the city had no lights, no cars, no street lights, no porch lights, nothing. It was complete, utter darkness. And the first time in my life, because there were no lights at all anywhere, when you went outside, you could see the stars so clear. It was almost like you could grab them. It was gorgeous. And it was the only thing lighting up the city. And it was so beautiful. But, with that beauty came death, came the houses moving. That's why you see this house looks like it's about to float away. And then the one star, which is like the Northern Star, which, had to do with death. And then this is me like personal death, but just yourself dying because you were leaving the city that you love so much and you were going away. Like the slaves had to go up north. They didn't love, what the situation they were in, but it was still relatable to me. And that's that piece. Next slide, please. Okay, Strange Fruit. Now this was a hard one because I cried after this piece. People look at it and say, well, Jay, that's not your portrait, but actually it is, it was like, how do I express what happened to me before, during, and after? And it was about the slave collars, which you will see. That collar with the spikes is this was probably the closest to a traditional slave collar. And if anyone's ever seen one, they're rare. I've only seen one or two, but I had the opportunity to purchase one in Harvey, Louisiana before I opened my store, my boutique. And my business partner was like, oh, that's so negative, don't get it. But the lady, I thought it was some kind of piece of jewelry because it looked small, like I was like a bracelet. And she said it was probably for a child, but they were put on the slaves in order for them to not be able to rest, prop their heads up against a tree. They would never be comfortable laying down. And for whatever reasons, that was what that collar was for. And I never used it in my work until after Katrina, because I kept saying to myself, that's how I felt. I couldn't sleep when I was there. I had to watch the children and make sure nobody was breaking in. I had to make sure I couldn't sleep for days, the 5 days I was there till we left. I couldn't sleep when we were somewhere sleeping with strangers, you know, in one of the evacuation centers because I didn't want anybody to take the children. And then just the nonstop hustle and bustle trying to figure out things. So this piece is about heartbreak. It's about, you know, presenting myself, opening myself up, and the poison fruit basically, you know, being on display. Like this is who I am, you know, and the markings were like tribal markings. So there was something that I wrote or had written for my first show at when I first had my very first show, which with all of my pieces, most of my Hurricane Katrina pieces, called Strange, and it's Strange Fruit. It says, okay, so throughout the African diaspora, the indigenous cultures, children who experience the rite of passage from childhood to adulthood, and that's where the tattooing of the face, the skin, branding, puberty, circumcision, that kind of thing, etc. These are the physical rites of passage that evolved both personally and professionally while I was trying to deal with regrouping my life. Having gone to my own personal rite of passage, it's the experience of growth and renewal. And however, like physical rites of passage, the scars will be present forever. I mean, I found that just looking at that video of 10 years after Katrina, I was tearing up. So, but it makes you stronger. So this was my self-portrait, and it was more of an inner and a spiritual and an emotional awakening, because my life had been so privileged by my parents. I had such a wonderful life. And then all of a sudden I found myself in a life and death experience, and it forever changed me. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here we go, another marking, the fleur-de-lis. The fleur-de-lis is one of our symbols. The X with the markings were on the homes when the military came in to check to see who was alive or dead and what the remains were. They marked the homes. And that was also a symbol of, you know, coming back to New Orleans. That was a scar. So it still goes along with the last one that we had. The fleur-de-lis, unfortunately, we love the fleur-de-lis, but it also was a branding mechanism for the slaves when they came into Louisiana. Next slide, please. Now, this is the gatekeepers. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Dr. Simmons, Amber, we're going to start talking about the gatekeepers. We saw some other gatekeepers and we saw a lot of gates, and I will talk about the significance of the gates.
That sounds good. Did you have any comments right now, Amber? Would you like to wait?
I think it's going great so far. I'll let JRenee continue. I wanted to kind of comment on the idea of kind of like leaving a part of yourself like in the city, like after Katrina happened, how that was sort of traumatic. Like now we kind of mark time like pre and post Katrina when we talk about New Orleans, and that's how a lot of people are talking about COVID right now. And so now I guess I'll have those 3 different or 4 different sorts of time markers, hopefully, in my life of pre and post Katrina, and then pre and post COVID, hopefully soon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. JRenee, so if you can go ahead and with the gatekeeper section, and then we can pause there too and kind of think about some of the connections, you know, culturally, right, you know, after that point before you go into the last few pieces.
Okay. Well, the gatekeepers are, this is took over a year to do this piece. It's a huge window that I actually got from a gentleman who has a vintage store. I'm trying to think of the name. I would love to plug him right now, in Northwest DC. And he knew I was a reverse glass painter and found these beautiful old windows in the attic and called me and said, I've got something for you. So this one I started in DC and I finished in South Carolina. And you'll see a number of the gatekeepers next, and I just want to let you know how the gatekeepers came into as an inspiration. So gatekeepers represent the ancestors who have been there for generations, who guard the city. And you know, throughout the city, there's so many. They say them ghosts or haunts or whatever, but the buildings, because they're old, the cemeteries, because they're old, because they've been hundreds of years, over 300 years now, that, you know, and we're one of the many cities that didn't tear our city down. Like a lot of people love to tear the old buildings down. New Orleans kept all those buildings and they refurbished them. You just can't go in there and tear them down. I think Savannah and Charleston are similar, but New Orleans is on a larger scale. So I was in New Orleans about 3 months or so when they first let us come back into the city, and I needed to see what was going on with my home, the home I was purchasing, my store, and I got with some other friends who were coming in we decided to come in the same time to have support. And I was walking in the Jackson Square by the Pentabla, and I was talking to one of my friends, and it was dark. And I was looking to my side talking, and I felt like somebody walking past me, and I thought it was actually someone walking past me, and I felt like a bump, you know, and I saw like light, like white, and I turned around and I didn't see anyone. And I kept saying, I know people are like, okay, Jay, but really that happened to me. And I asked, I said, did you see someone? I was asking my friend, I said, did somebody just pass? I just felt like a bump, and I was trying to explain to them what was going on. I said, "Ooh, we need to get out of here. Like, this is scary." And then I realized, because I was having that feeling the whole time I was there, that even though I was alone or walking with a couple of people, that we weren't there alone. And I felt like because it was quiet and there was no one there, that the haints or the ancestors had gotten out, and they were out there and protecting the city until the people come home, to the New Orleanians and the residents come back to New Orleans. So that's how the gatekeepers got started. So when you see the gatekeepers, there's a lot going on, like in this piece, but most of them look like they don't belong there, like an old black and white photo that you see in a vintage store, and you know there's a history there, but you really don't know anything about that person, and they're selling it. So that's the feel of each one of these pieces. And yeah, so this is one of my favorites because of you see the slave with the baboon with a slave collar, and you see her with the lace one, which is a whimsical slave collar, and she's nurturing a child, which represents, you know, carrying the burden of the people and nurturing the city until we come back. And of course, the cemetery is in the background because the haints are, or the ghosts are those ancestors that have passed. And she has tribal markings. You see all the tattooing on her arms and legs. So there's a connection with the other piece, that we talked about earlier, my piece, Strange Fruit. Next slide, please. And here's another, this is Gatekeeper 2, this is the second one, and you see the older man in the corner, he represents that, and there's a lot of cultural things going on there. He has a slave collar, but it's mostly travel jewelry, and you see the New Orleans sign in the background and the flooding, but you see the music and the eyes on the city. And he has that third eye, which we'll talk about when we get to one of the paintings that inspired the third eye, the colored eye. Next slide, please. Now, these are some other gatekeepers, but this one in particular is different. So the gatekeepers either have the third eye, or, you know, you see that image coming under the flowers. And these both were wonderful pieces. Actually, the one that's in New York City, a really good friend of mine purchased that. And he had to convince me to sell it because I wasn't going to sell it. But they have a wrap on their head. The other one looked like she had a veil on her head. And the wraps were important because in New Orleans, there is something that was passed. Gosh, I should have the actual year. I don't have it on me, but it was probably late 1800s. The women of New Orleans, there was a law passed called the Tignon Law, Tignon. So if you look that up, Tignon, they can give you a lot of details. There's actually a beautiful museum on Esplanade that's also owned by the McKenna Museum that talks about African American, Haitian, and Creole culture in New Orleans. And it's owned by Beverly McKenna. And she's the wife of Dr. McKenna, who owns the museum uptown where some of my work is. But they go into the details. What happened was that a lot of the women of color, the free women of color, the Creole women of color, they call them octoroons or quadroons, you know, some of them mulattoes, some of them Black women, all of the women of color. The French men were trying to have them as mistresses. And so they didn't like their hair out. So the women came to, I think it was the governor, and they passed this law, meaning no matter how much Black blood you had to wear a wrap on your head as kind of like degrading the woman. So when you see these portraits, and you'll see a lot of portraits, you actually see Marie Laveau, she is always in a wrap on her head. That was the law. And but what the women did, then instead of, you know, accepting that this was something that wasn't of honor or something that was to degrade them, they started to weed and put feathers and flowers in their wraps. And actually, I don't want to say this for sure, but from what I was told, the white handkerchief that they wave around at the second lines of jazz funerals represented the women taking their wraps off their head when the music would come through the streets and swinging the wraps, letting their hair out and swinging the wraps in the air. So, but I can't be for sure because I'm trying to get details on that for a painting that I'm doing. So I'm trying to work and find that out for sure. But that's what I've been told by, you know, a couple of people who are historians, because I used to live next to a historian who taught at Loyola University years ago when I lived in the Treme. So that's what these pieces represent. Next slide, please. Okay, so Deuces Wild is another one that would represent a tignon, but it's basically a crown. So she represents the woman's personality, the sweet, sultry, beautiful, sashayed woman, and the softness and the beauty within herself and outward, but also the uninhibited side that's hidden beneath her exterior and is on display because behind closed doors and on display behind closed doors. And also it represents not only the two different sides of a woman. And people always say, oh, women in New Orleans are so beautiful. Well, I, of course, feel like women all over the world are beautiful, but yes, they are. But more importantly, New Orleans was also a place where the tignon was, they had octoroon balls and quadroon balls where they would have the women come to these balls for the rich men to pick as mistresses, and the whole allure of them coming, you know, to be presented, which I never really enjoyed that part of New Orleans history. But more importantly, also we have the red light district that was there for a very long time, and until the British, I think it was, they came in and was like, no, we're not having this. And they tore the whole red light district, which was at the most beautiful buildings and homes. And that's also where a lot of jazz performers played in the brothels. So that's Deuces Wild. Next slide. Thank you. Now, this is Madonna and Child. It's also part of the Gatekeeper series because one of the things that disturbed me probably a year or so afterwards was the distress and the distraught of most of the New Orleans citizens who had homes or either bought homes that were flooded. There was so much confusion with what the government was going to do as far as helping to fix people's buildings up, their homes, and you're living in a city somewhere where you're having after a while to pay rent. You have to put your kids in school, or you're trying to figure out if you want to come back home because you were so distressed. And people just started selling the property in disgust because they were waiting on insurance companies. Most of the people were waiting. They have these gutted buildings. They were waiting for the insurance companies, and FEMA and the government, they didn't want to do anything until after the insurance companies paid what they were going to pay, and then whatever was left, they were going to come in. Personally, I felt like the government should have just taken care of everybody's homes, and then they individually dealt with everybody's insurance policies, and the insurance company paid the government. That would have made it easier for people to immediately come back, but that didn't happen. So you have Madonna and Child, you have her walking away from the church because you see the church is for sale. The crucifixion is up there, and it's almost like people were praying for the city, but they weren't walking in faith. And so that's why you see her walking away from the church and the crucifixion in this piece. And there's a lot going on, and there's, again, that discolored eye. So reverse glass painting. She's a gatekeeper. Next slide, please. Thank you. And this is another one. They walk among us. You can see in this piece, this is a traditional, another piece. This is also in the McKenna Museum. And you see the modern photo collages and what I did in this piece. So you get this idea of new and fun and revelry. And we're, of course, in the cemeteries again, but then here's that image that looks really old from the past or from, you know, hundreds of years ago. Next slide, please. Now, this is another gatekeeper, and we have a lot of gatekeepers because the gates are some of the most important things about New Orleans. If you know anything about New Orleans history, I mentioned before, I lived next to a historian who would give me so much wonderful information when I was in the Treme for almost 10 years. And the gates were made by, I'm almost positive it was the Congolese that were iron workers that they imported for the gates. And the Senegalese were the ones who made this special type of brick, because in Senegal, the weather, them being on the coast and the water, is extremely humid like New Orleans weather. And they made this specially type of brick that she called a slave brick, because the slaves created these bricks from Senegalese tribes. They created these red bricks which line the inside and outside and the streets of New Orleans and the French Quarter, the Treme. I mean, and if they paved over those streets after a while, right? But when they would dig up, you'd see them digging up these red, powdery, dark burgundy red bricks, and they're called slave bricks. And so the gates are the only thing, even when the hurricane hit and buildings were falling and moving and floating from one area to the next over the gates were the things that stood strong. And so, and actually a lot of the gates have, you see the upside down heart, that's like a Sankofa symbol from the Ghanaian people, but it means knowing your past to understand your present as you move forward with your future. And this one, you have the angel with the slave collar waiting, you know, Indian, and both of both persons in the corner are basically the older ancestors. And of course, Satchmo, one of the greatest jazz musicians in the world, is there as one of the ancestors. So it's really three ancestors in this piece holding the city down. And I made the sky, if you look at the sky, I made it like a hurricane. You see it in the background? I swirled it like the hurricane. Next slide, please. And this is another gatekeeper, Missing New Orleans with Louis Armstrong. And this one is similar to the Strange Fruit piece because it's about New Orleanians really having to be vulnerable, stripping themselves down to nothing, but also holding on to the gates. The candles you see leading the path outward and looking in, it's like a vigil, but also she's strong holding on to those gates. She's trying to lift herself back up. And you see more New Orleans house in the background and the angels that deal with Catholicism. Next slide, please. And I think this might be the last gatekeeper, but this is from the African Coast to the New Orleans Post. And this is definitely a Treme piece, carnival, Mardi Gras, people hanging out on the steps and the porch, the music, and the blue image, of course, that is fused like a mask is carnival revelry, Mardi Gras Indian, which we'll talk about. The Mardi Gras Indians is definitely another one. And it really reflects on the tradition, because there were a lot of different immigrants and people who came. So you had the French, the Spanish, there's the Native, of course, the Native Indians, the Chitimacha and other indigenous Native Americans had a lot to do with the food and the culture, but everything had to do with the slaves coming in. There were more people of color that were slaves or enslaved or free people of color that influenced the city than any other group of people, because of how the city was, how colonization, and New Orleans was a major port city for the slaves. Next slide, please. So, Mr. Okra, this is probably one of my fun images, because we talked about the sounds and the smells, and there are lots of characters in New Orleans that I remember, like the bead lady, which is this crazy lady who had a helmet and she'd go through the French Quarter giving people lucky beads, and the duck lady who, of course, all these people have passed on, but she would ride. She was an older woman that would ride, usually in a skirt with her duck on a leash, and she'd have roller skates on. And Mr. Okra. There's several other characters, but Mr. Okra, I remember him because he had this crazy truck. You see, shut up and eat all your veggies, and he would yell on on the mic all throughout, like the ice cream truck, get your fruits and vegetables, and he'd come early in the morning, and just like the second lines, people would go out there and get fresh fruits and vegetables from him, and he'd go throughout the city. And he was a big, jolly, fellow. And I was asked to do this piece because they did a documentary on him, and they wanted something for the premiere of the documentary. And that's Mr. Okra, one of the many characters in New Orleans. Next slide, please. Okay, I think we saw this one. Next slide, please.
Okay. These are beautiful pieces. I know that something you said makes me think about just memory home, and just that there's for you, that somebody's watching out and keeping a watchful eye. Again, the gatekeepers. That idea. I think I told you. After Hurricane Katrina, the university established kind of a welcome center on campus, right on the edge of campus, partnered with some local community members and organizations. And so we were, in a sense, kind of welcoming people who were coming from hurricane, coming especially from New Orleans, here. And we were also part of a research team through African American Studies. And something that I remember from that time, the people talked about that was just created such an impact. And I remember these stories to this day, is that there were a group of people who were leaving New Orleans, and they were faced with a decision. They were presented with the option to go to Houston on a bus or get on a plane, and without knowing where they were going. And so the people who came to Columbia, this group, they came to Columbia, and this particular group of people we talked to said, we'll take the flight, we'll take the plane. They didn't know where they were going. Mid-flight, they were told they were going to Columbia, South Carolina. So can you imagine? I mean, they landed, and again, the Welcome Center was on the edge of campus. I think the American Red Cross was set up. People received vouchers. At that point in time, they were taking taxis, they were in hotels, they were given food vouchers to go eat at Lizard's Thicket. And one of the things that I remember too from those interviews at that time, a couple different things, people talked about the food. They said, we don't have kitchens, we don't have, kitchenettes, we can't cook, and we're eating at Lizard's Thicket. And they were thankful, they were appreciative of that. But they talked about the food, and they talked about the gumbo, and they said it's not quite the same, and we can't gather on Sundays like we usually do. And so it was all this, what they were missing, thinking about home, at the same time they were trying to just kind of be here and have this fresh start. So, I think about that, and I saw some of that, as I was thinking, in some of the work that you presented in the beginning, and it made me think about right now with Mr. Okra too, just home and how it calls you in certain kinds of ways, you know? And again, the idea that you can return, at some point in time, but we know some people haven't. Some have and some haven't, just for different reasons. Let's see here. I know we're on this part, and I know some questions are starting to come through in the chat box too. So we'll be ready with a Q&A pretty soon. Amber, did you want to say anything right now? You have a comment?
Yeah, I guess something I've been reflecting on and thinking about missing New Orleans. I feel like I'm always missing home. I always want to be home. And like making connections to what's going on now in the country, right, with COVID. So to me, this is another like traumatic event that people are sharing in. And when news of COVID first hit and we had the extended spring break in at USC, my first instinct was to evacuate and get close to family. So my closest family is my older sister who lives in Atlanta. And I was preparing and I was thinking about how do I prepare for like a hurricane? I was like, I need to make sure I have like bottled water. I need to make sure, whatever I leave with, I don't know when I'm coming back. And it wasn't like a mandatory evacuation sort of thing, but those same sorts of like instincts kicked in where it felt very much like the same kind of like mental and physiological kind of like response to everything. And so I'm thinking about, I'm a grad student now and I have a lot more independence when I did when I was 10, but I think about the undergrads at USC right now who have been displaced and undergrads across the country who are being displaced because of COVID and different sorts of university responses and the ways that people are having to cope in similar ways of being away from home. And at least for me, I know that being away from home for just those 4 months, now whenever I'm away from home for any period of time, I'm always thinking about and planning for the next time that I'm going to go back, because I think being away from home gave me such a sense of belonging and comfort in being in New Orleans. So when I'm not there, I very much feel like something's missing, going from living in that apartment with this 2-bedroom apartment with like my sisters and my grandparents and my parents, and everything was so hectic at the time. But now it causes me pain to like be away from them for extended periods of time. And so I'm still thinking through some of these connections between Katrina and COVID and sense of belonging and place when thinking about trauma and coping mechanisms. And so thinking about access to food and traditions and sense of community and things like that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Amber, for that. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, JRenee, so this is, I think the cultural part. I mean, again, kind of thinking about some of the cultural traditions, we'll enter this discussion right here. So I think shortly after these slides, we can have just another conversation, and then we'll open up for the Q&A. I think we have a few questions lined up. Thank you.
You need to unmute your mic, please.
So I'm sorry, you're still muted, I believe.
Okay, is that better? We're back.
Yes.
Okay. Yay! Okay. I was saying that I really appreciate what Amber and Dr. Simmons, what you were saying about probably what people are going through with COVID right now is probably the closest thing to what the Katrina evacuees and people in New Orleans were feeling. A sense of, where are my friends, family, connecting, not being able to connect. And it's interesting you made that comparison, because it's very much like that. A sense of loneliness. People don't really understand you. They don't understand why you want food from New Orleans. Crawfish. I mean, we have crawfish boils and we have all this different food that surrounded usually by seafood. But, we have the gumbo, we have the etouffee, we have the Creole, jambalaya, we have red bean and rice day, Mondays, red beans and rice. People make that. And that's a tradition that's been happening forever, and you make it a certain way. And if you're from New Orleans, even with the po' boy sandwiches, you know, that's what's happening. Now, one of the things that like is really sad right now, and I know we're going to go into that a little bit about what has changed post Katrina, is that the New Orleans food, they're having a hard time keeping up. Like they're coming with all these new people from all over who've moved into the city. If you can't afford to live in the city, then the people who have been cooking for generations can't afford to get into the city to work at the nice restaurants to make the food that's traditional New Orleans food. Okay, so we're going to talk about that later, but that's one of the many things that is happening. And I'm getting information from not only myself being there, I haven't been there in 5 years because of a car accident I was in, but I hear New Orleanians complaining all the time. You know, one of my closest friends, her husband's a chef. He doesn't even like to eat in the French Quarter really that much anymore because they're not real true New Orleanians. They're cooking the real food with the real spices, and you know, they're making variations of what they think it is or coming up with some kind of nouveau New Orleans food. And that's one of the many things that is a problem with the culture losing it, or New Orleans losing a lot of important traditions if the people don't come back. And the people who do come back, they can't afford to live in the city, you know, so. But this, I know you want to go to the next thing. This is voodoo dolls. Voodoo dolls, again, once we talked about that with the first Oshun Rising piece. So you see the king cake babies. I made my different variations of what, you know, people have an idea of, but it's the third eye. You know, the regalia, there's a lot of Mardi Gras stuff. It's about combining all the different cultures and what the religion is. And really, it's an unknown. I mean, you really don't know what it is unless you're in that religion. And I can't say for myself because I grew up Catholic, but I know about it from studying and everything. So next slide, please. And here's another one. This is the second one that I did while I was in Washington, D.C. You see the spiky, whimsical slave collar on, and then you see the crazy eye, which we're still going to get to the crazy eye. Because for me, when people can see the future or the past, they call them having a third eye. And I don't know, I can remember what they say they are in the Bible. But this piece was about presenting something that really, you see the hands out with the fruit and vegetables, something sweet, and trying to force feed something to the New Orleanians that they didn't want, right? And you see the president at the time, Bush, and the howling monkey, which I have monkeys in there a lot, but there is a place in New Orleans that I would love to go. They had these break dancers, and it was this guy with this pet monkey that he would have that was just all over the place, and he would do stuff, and that was part of, you know, and so the howling monkey represents the yelling and screaming and people basically trying to get their attention. And there's a Native American in there, which is from the commercial with the teardrop. You know, when they see people trashing the city, it's like, where's the city going? And then the family's being torn apart. So there's a lot going on in this piece. You have to look at it up close and for a while, but it's part of that whole we're not resting, you know, as long as we are not home or we can't get home or some semblance of home. So there we go. Next slide, please. Now, this is when we start talking about Oshun Rising, how Oshun is about beauty, and the Mardi Gras Indians probably are the, I don't even know what to say, but probably the top, what you would think about art, because they've been around for over 100 years. I think about 135 or 40 years now. They make their costumes. They take a year to make their costumes, and then they have a whole group of people, whether they're family members or other Mardi Gras Indians. And it's a subculture in New Orleans that's a lived culture. Now, that's the thing that also is a tradition that could die. Because if the people are not there to pass on the beading, they do all the hand beading from hand. It takes a whole year, and there's a huge headdress, and the suit and all the way to the shoes are all done with beads, and a lot of them tell stories. And it would take a while. I know we're under time constraints to explain like what the different tribes are, but some of the Indian tribes, the Yellow Pocahontas, they have Uptown Revelers. There are a lot of different ones, and they started out getting costumes, sequence dresses, things that people were throwing away to bead up for Mardi Gras. And the thing is that they wouldn't allow a lot of the blacks, the slaves, the people, free people of color or black people to participate. So this was kind of a way of them rebelling against the establishment. And then you had Zulu that came along, which was one of the first pleasure clubs, Mardi Gras carnival clubs for men that actually paraded. They called them unveiling and coming out on Mardi Gras Day, and then it's St. Joseph's Day, Super Sunday, are the 2 days that the Indians all come out, and they have their own tribal music and they have their own like language. If you've ever listened to the Neville Brothers, they say some of the things, you know, about the way and all these little things that the Indians only understand what it is, but it's very tribal, lots of tambourines, and they do get with some of the jazz musicians, but mostly it's a more ethnic group. And they dress up like Native Americans. At first, the Native Americans had a problem with them because they thought they were making fun of Indians, but they are actually paying this is where they pay their respects to the Indians that took the slaves in when they left the bayous so they could get away. They found the Indian tribes, and then they found safe refuge away from colonization and slavery. And so that's what they do. It takes a year to make the costumes. The costumes are gorgeous. They're extremely heavy and they're extremely beautiful, and it's an art form. So if anyone who's never been there or don't really know about them, I suggest you look up the New Orleans Mardi Gras Indians, Google them, and you can see some images. I think I have one of my books. I have tons of books, but there was one for the Indians that that dealt with the Mardi Gras Indians. I'm trying to think of which book it is. I'll figure out which one it is. But yeah, next slide, please. This is a beautiful, beautiful group of people. And this one, Jazz Trio, is just what it is. It's a jazz piece. It's the passion of jazz, the music, you know, it started there in Congo Square, and that's the one thing that's still there. A lot of the juke joints are closed. They're real, like, raw jazz. I have some stories I can go into, but we don't really have time. But they're my memories that no matter what happens to New Orleans, they can't ever take that away from me. But that's what this represents, my experience with the Funky Bud and Donna's and Cafe Brazil and all the places where the real music has been playing for a very long time. Next slide, please. Okay, this is Jazz Finale. Now, this one is the one that we're going to talk about with the third eye. We've been waiting a long time for this piece to come up so I could talk about that third eye. Okay, so when I did this piece, I wanted to do a piece about, so New Orleans has always had hurricanes, and there's a lot of other places along the coast that have had hurricanes, but New Orleans being below sea level is what damaged. So I want people to know that after you survive the actual storm, and I was there was no water on the ground. So the levees breaking created like a bowl, because the levees hold the water from the city, and then it just poured into the city, and that's when the real damage and destruction happened. If we could have had those levees were strong enough to hold that water back, a lot of people would have been able to come back home, and it's very, very unfortunate. But the day before, and the week or weeks before, or days before Hurricane Katrina, business as usual was going on. Music, second lines, tapping, you know, laughter, and nonstop, because that's something that happens all the time. We don't have, like, it's really quiet here. My son was having a problem with going to certain, like coming to South Carolina, because even though he enjoyed meeting people, people were nice to him, he said it was too quiet for him because he was used to the revelry of New Orleans, the food, the sounds, the smells, the noise. We don't really have honking, well, we didn't have honking cars or taxis before, but the bells from the streetcar, that kind of thing. And so on one side, you see that cemetery, you see the darkness and the light. The light was us enjoying life as usual. And then the very next day, it went into dismay and quiet and serene. But this particular piece is a story that happened. And so right after the storm, when you live in a city like that, when there's no lights and it's extremely quiet because there's nothing going on, there's nothing open, there's no electricity, there are no cars, there's no nothing. The one piece of music I heard was a gentleman in his home with all his windows and doors open, and he had just a little bit of water in his home. And we were walking because I needed to get soy milk for my daughter. She would not drink any other kind of milk. And so I ended up going almost 16 blocks into the quarter to find milk in one of the stores that was, broken into, but to try and find soy milk, which I did, and a few other things with my niece, because we both could swim. And I said, let's go, because we're going to have to do this. They were telling us they didn't know how long we would be in New Orleans, and maybe weeks before they came to get us. So, out of desperation, this is what we did, knowing it was dangerous. I saw a floating body in the water. I had to take my niece on a whole nother street because it's like she's going to die if she sees this body floating in the water. She's already freaking out about the bugs and other stuff in the water. But we were so hot, and we had gotten this stuff, and we were keeping it on our shoulder to keep it from the dirty water. We heard this music, and everyone that was around was looking like, where's this music coming from? It was a gentleman playing the piano. And that's what you see in this painting here. And it was like he was outside because he had everything open, even his front doors, all of his storm doors and the French doors were open. So it was like it was outside, but you couldn't see him. And when we passed by, he stopped and asked us, we were just saying how beautiful it was to hear music, because we hadn't heard any music in days, no TV, no music, no radio, no nothing. And he started telling me his story, and he had a very unusual eye, and it was discolored. And I don't remember his name, and the home was across from the back of the Mahalia Jackson Theater there in the Treme. And he offered to bag up our food in a garbage bag so it wouldn't get wet as we continued our journey. And it was so beautiful. It was one of the other beautiful moments that I had, was speaking with this guy, and he inspired this piece. And the whole idea of roots, and the guy in this tree looking and listening to the music, and people in a sense of serenity, because people looked calm, like they felt good for that moment. They were passing by with everything that was chaotic. They were like excited about this music that was playing, this original jazz music. And he wasn't just, he could play. I wish I could remember his name, and hopefully he survived and he's okay and he was able to come back home. But it was a very interesting, and that's what inspired the third eye, as well as, we never thought we'd come back to nothing. Like, we always felt like, oh, New Orleans is never going to go anywhere. And everything is at risk right now with the new New Orleans. And we'll get to that later. Next slide, please. I think we're finished. I think that we've ended the pictures. Here's some resources. I have some books I'd love to talk about, but I'm going to let Dr. Simmons or Amber. I hope I did it again.
Oh, that was beautiful. That was beautiful. Yeah, really enjoyed listening to you talk about your work pieces. We were all drawn in and just captivated. Just beautiful work.
Thank you.
Let's see here. I know, in the interest of time, why don't we go ahead, because we can continue our conversation here, and let's weave in some of the questions. I know we have a few questions here in the Q&A box, and I think Betty and Chelsea are going to help us with the questions, right?
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so the first question that we have here, how has South Carolina influenced your art post Hurricane Katrina?
Thank you. Whoever asked the question. South Carolina is my mother's home. She was born here. And at first, the reason why we transferred from Washington, D.C., because I've done a lot of work in Washington, D.C. I created a huge mural for a restaurant that opened up in the historic 14th and U area in DC. And I really wanted to stay in DC because I knew I had a lot of connections. And actually one of my friends, her twin who works on the news, saw me on the news when I came in weeks afterwards. The news was there and she was like, oh my God, I found her. And, you know, I tried to stay there, but DC is a beautiful, wonderful place, but it's very hectic to get started all over again from nothing. And that's why I found myself trying to figure out what to do. And then after that, you know, the weather was really cold. And my mother was with me. And even though she spent a lot of time in Memphis, it's very transitional as far as the weather, you know, and they have a fall, spring, you know, winter. She wasn't used to all that cold and snow. So we decided to come to South Carolina, to her hometown, because I was like, well, it's slower. My grandmother, her mother was still living, and I have an aunt here, and we had some cousins. And I said, well, let's go there because I always had beautiful memories of South Carolina. So the work that I have started creating, because at first it was an adjustment because it is different, you know, and people were so sweet and generous, but being also Catholic, which is kind of funny. I'd say, oh yeah, I'm Catholic. And this is the Bible Belt here. It's almost worse than saying I was maybe a devil when they look at me like Catholic. But it was, people were very warm and generous and kind, and it was a great place to sit back and reflect. But one of the things that happened, you know, speaking about the new work, was that we would come here every Christmas, most of the summers, and we would visit my great-grandmother, my great-great-aunt, and she died, both of them at almost 100. And we had uncles, my grandfather was living, my other great-grandmother was living. And I remember all the wonderful memories that I had visiting in Florence and Marion, South Carolina, and then we'd go and spend lots of time in Myrtle Beach. And that was before it looked like right now. That was a long time ago. So I started remembering all these wonderful porch stories, all the stories that my great-grandmother would tell me about, you know, her life and my grandmother's life and, you know, what she did in Harlem and how my mother was born in the house and our slave ancestors. And I said, well, you know what? I need to find out more about this side of the family. And that's created a new sense of direction as far as a whole new group of work. And actually, I was doing, I showed a few pieces at the USC back in March, but in February, but the new work was going to be at Taft's Arts Center, and, you know, that closed, and I was a resident there. We were doing a residency, and we were going to be presenting. So I have a lot of pieces that show the Southern tradition. Actually, I have this series called my tree series, and you'll see images of roads or country scenes because we used to drive so much from Columbia to Florence to Marion to Myrtle Beach, and you see all those wonderful scenes of the cows and, you know, the horses, and we would say pick out which somebody's house, my brother and sister and I, and just wonderful memories of like picking peas and snapping peas and beans on the porch with my great-grandmother, my great-great-aunt. So that's the new work that I was doing. And it does influence, you know, that's the influence I was having. And I feel like that's in my heart. The reason why I was supposed to be here in South Carolina was to create this ancestral work and start there and then move to my father's side, which would be more New Orleans, Memphis, Mississippi.
Thank you, JRenee. So the next question that we have is, what is reverse glass painting?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so reverse glass painting is the best way to explain it. It is an old art form that's at least 500 years. Sometimes they say it's older than that, but we know it's at least 500 years old. And it may be even older than that because they do have some Egyptian work that they found that's reverse glass. But it is the actual painting on glass backwards in the reverse to be seen through the front. So what happens is that when you you have when you paint a regular canvas. I don't know if this is an art student or not, but this is the easiest way to explain what it is. When you're painting on canvas or paper, what you put last on a canvas, like let's say your signature, highlights, detail, that goes first in the reverse on the back of the glass to be seen, because it's all the work is on the back and the image you see on the front. So you have to do it backwards. So those things go, what goes last on the canvas goes first on the glass, and then you move and blend backwards to the end. So what goes first on a canvas goes last on the glass. And that's what reverse glass is. And in the French call it églamager. And I actually, I've been doing this for almost 30 years. I can't even keep up how long it's been, but I know it's at least 27, 28 years. But the Senegalese, because they were also colonized by the French, it's popular there. Also in Croatia, and there you can see reverse glass paintings, but there are more people doing it and, fooling around with it. But I had my first experience with reverse glass seeing Asian work from like Pakistan and China and Japan, reverse glass paintings in antique stores when I would visit sometimes the stores in New Orleans. And then a Senegalese artist named Aziz, he's known for doing reverse glass, and he gave me the basic techniques, and I just took what I learned. I had a wonderful instructor in New Orleans, John Scott, and he was always taught us to push and challenge ourselves. So that's what I did. That's when I started working and testing work out. I hope I answered the question. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, what are some of the racial inequalities that you noticed, and what are some things that we should know?
Okay. Who wants to, and do you want me to answer that, or Amber, or does it? I'll go first. Well, one of some of the so let's talk about the city first. You kind of have to have a setup, and really you have to learn that, like, the history of New Orleans. New Orleans, being a port city, of course, had more Africans, enslaved Africans, just like Charleston. There was a port city, so there were more of us than, of course, the colonists. Then after the Haitian Revolution, the French, where they conquered and they beat the French, more Africans, more people of color and Africans of Haiti came into New Orleans. Okay, so you had a lot of different also immigrants that came, like the Irish, the Jews, the Germans, and the Italians. But the largest group of people were people of color, because you have all these beautiful buildings, these antebellum homes, the plantations up north, whatever. But then guess what? There are all these service quarters behind in the back. So there were always more servants, than, of course, the people who own the house. So it's always been like that. And the city was always set up like that. So the racial inequalities, what I find out is that, just like in a lot of other cities, you can look at Harlem in New York and parts of Chicago. And what has happened is those areas that have been culturally influenced by people of color, whether it's the food, the music, after Hurricane Katrina, they weren't making it readily available for people of color to come back. I have a friend who works for Greyhound. He's been working for Greyhound for almost 20 years. And one of the things that happened was the Greyhound buses weren't coming to New Orleans. So if you're a person of color and you're poor, because I wasn't rich, but still, in order for me to take care of my business, because a lot of times I wasn't able to take care of my business because things that I needed to take care of, I needed to be in New Orleans. So I had to fly. So who has a ticket when you're trying to get yourself together to come, and take care of your business? So if you have a building, and thank God, I story for me, because I wish I had my home still that I was purchasing, but people who had homes were living somewhere else, trying to pay rent after a while because the government wasn't paying. It was a time slot. So here they have an open building that's gutted and they need to fix it up. But guess what? They weren't able to. right? So then you come into, I'm paying rent, I'm working here, I'm doing this, and I need to get home and take care of business. And then they were doing things like, you know, charging people for the grass being overgrown. Well, you're not there. How are you going to cut the grass? I mean, it was a lot of little bitty things that ended up being frustrating for people of color. And then it was unfortunate because one of the things that happened is when they allowed people to come in and businesses were saying, well, we're going to rebuild the city, so we're going to give you $15 an hour because they were trying to lure people back into the city. You had people who own buildings and own property that they could rent. They said, okay, well, they're making more money, so we're going to up the rent. And it's been like that ever since. I just had a friend send me a picture in an area that I literally lived right during Hurricane Katrina, uptown, 6 blocks away, Washington, Louisiana. It was uptown, but it wasn't an area that was, you know, ridiculous in rent. I was paying for a 2-bedroom shotgun, like $500 a month. They have starting at $2,800 for an apartment, 6 blocks away from where I lived. And I'm trying to figure out who in New Orleans can afford that and what jobs do they have that they can afford starting. So we're talking about probably a 1-bedroom. So yeah, it's pretty bad. And it's been a lot of things. They're going up on the taxes. People can't pay their taxes, so they're losing their homes. You know, and these are people, some people who've had their homes, their whole life has been in their generation with their family. Yeah. That's the beginning. Amber, I don't know if there's anything you have to add.
Yes, I'll just add a little bit to that because I think the history, the trajectory that you gave, JRenee, was really comprehensive. But I think like the word that really sums this up is gentrification that's happening in the city. So a lot of the services that JRenee was talking about, like throughout her presentation, like the po' boys, the different kinds of things that people come to consume in like the tourism industry, a lot of those things they rely on the labor of Black people. But what you'll see at the same time is Black people being forced out of the city because of these sorts of things where, you know, since Katrina, like different buildings, different neighborhoods have been gentrified where like properties are being flipped. They're starting to charge like exorbitant amounts of rent. And so you'll see like different groups of people are being pushed out of the city because of this. And so when you have like the people of New Orleans being pushed out and not being able to afford to live, then those sorts of things that people like to consume through like tourism start to be less and less authentic because it's not actual like people from New Orleans who are doing those labors of love anymore. And instead it's kind of replicates of that that are being overpriced, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And the only thing I would just add, I was just thinking too, kind of thinking, going back to Katrina and the Road Home program, because they didn't, in that video clip, they didn't mention it in that particular segment, but that kind of set the stage too for displacement and kind of the out-migration that we saw with a lot of Black people who left New Orleans too, because that was supposed to be a way to rebuild, you know, your home and for you to stay. And so what happened with a lot of Black people is that in some areas in New Orleans, their homes had been devalued before Katrina. So they were only able to get an amount up to what their homes were valued pre-Katrina. And so they weren't able to do anything. They weren't able to rebuild, you know. And so for a lot of people, they just wound up having to just leave, you know. So that also happened. It kind of set the stage for what we see. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the next question, would you move back to New Orleans?
For myself?
Yes.
Yes, hi. Would I move back to New Orleans? I would love to move back to New Orleans, but I don't want to be like the rest of the real New Orleanians that are just depressed. I mean, they see the changes. The closest thing for me is when the colonists were coming in and taking the Native Americans' land away, and you're looking at it like, what in the world is going on? That's the way I can explain it, because they're watching the city. You know, I literally have one friend who moved back and couldn't afford the rent, and it was in areas that he lived before, and he said it's still not the best area, but the rent is 3 and 4 times more than what he paid, and he had to buy something in Algiers in order to get a decent amount of money a month to stay because it's $650. He's a bus driver. He's like, how can I spend $1,500 on a studio or a one bedroom? That's ridiculous. And it's the same buildings, that were there. And he's also noticed that, like, when he's jogging, that a lot of the cars they don't have Louisiana license plates on them, I have another friend that works at one of the art establishments and said, you should see how many applications come in for jobs here, and they're not New Orleanians. They're from somewhere else. And so I don't want to, so another thing that happened that really saddened me, and we want to talk about the injustice, and this is, something that bothered me. South Carolina is still very reasonably priced. So I would love, because my roots are from here, to get something here first, but I'd love to buy a second home in New Orleans. I don't know if I'm still comfortable with just giving up everything and moving to New Orleans after what happened to Hurricane Katrina. It's still hard. Like, it was really hard for me to look at that video. But also, I feel like my kids and I feel like my roots are there. And I feel like as a New Orleanian, I want to contribute something, fight to keep what we need, because we're so dispersed still all over the place that we can't really fight for anything and be like with other New Orleanians fighting for the same purpose, and that's to keep the tradition. And one of another friend said, I think in 10 years it'll be disappearing. How do you spend $25 on a po' boy sandwich when the po' boy sandwich was made during Depression? It was created to feed a whole family. Now the po' boys are smaller and they're not for poor people anymore. Those kind of things, little bitty things like that. A lot of New Orleanians don't go out to clubs or do, entertainment that much anymore because they can't afford to get in, or they can't afford to, the prices are so high. So it's a love-hate situation, but I would like to go back, and maybe not, permanently, but to make a change, and then permanently when things get back to normal, which we don't know if it ever is going to get back to normal.
So thank you for that. We know that you don't live in New Orleans currently, but in your eyes, how has the pandemic affected New Orleans and its culture?
Well, New Orleans, Hi there again. New Orleans was hit hard. And my sister just moved back. She's in the Algiers area. She moved there after college. She went to school in Hampton, and then she moved to New Orleans for about 5-6 years before she went back up north. And now she's back there teaching, and she's a wonderful teacher. Things have changed. Things have changed a lot. I mean, they're dealing with it. Everybody is obeying the scientists, which is great. They started with the mask. And the thing that was the problem with New Orleans and COVID is that they had Mardi Gras. And I was the first female to do the Zulu poster. Okay. And that was 2012, I think 2012. But they were considering me for this year. And I was so devastated because the piece I did, they loved it. Everyone picked it. But the thing is, they used it for the invitation for the ball. And that's a whole nother thing we can't really get into. But at the end of the day, I was so excited that I looked like I was going to get the poster. I was ready to go. I was talking to Zulu members. I was like, I want to be on a float throwing beads and giving out coconuts. I was telling my kids, you guys haven't been back in a long time. We're going to get on the float. So I was really excited. And I was so happy that I dodged a bullet because COVID happened. And it's very unfortunate because, I mean, I'm sorry to be going into politics, but under this administration, if they had taken it serious, it's no way that they would have had Mardi Gras. No way. They canceled Jazz Fest. They've canceled the Louis Armstrong Festival, Essence Festival that's been there for over 20 years. For 4th of July weekend was canceled. They've canceled a lot of things. So financially, I know that it's hit, but New Orleans always bounces back. If they can bounce back from Hurricane Katrina, they'll bounce back from COVID-19. Great question.
I'd like to add to that and say that I think that New Orleans' response to COVID has been directly impacted by what happened with Katrina. So because of the trauma that the cities had to endure, I think that we take disasters really seriously. We have a lot of emergency preparedness. I'm saying we, like I'm still there. We have a lot of emergency preparedness like still in place. So when COVID happened, and when we saw those numbers start going up in New Orleans really rapidly and intensely, I mean, the city shut down. They took that really seriously. And I would say even under like the national administration that we have, the local government in New Orleans, Mayor Cantrell took that really seriously, took the necessary initiatives, made sure that there's a citywide mandate with masks and social distancing, and so I would say that that is directly linked to how we deal with emergencies and how we deal with like crowd preparedness and things like that with the different sorts of festivals that JRenee was talking about, because this is a city that likes to celebrate. And so if we're shutting down celebrations, something's serious.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So JRenee, the comments are that your artwork is fabulous, it's fantastic. So people really want to know, will there be an opportunity to see your artwork here in Columbia? Or do you have some ideas in mind about that already?
Well, thank you. We've done some stuff here in Columbia, and actually we had that one event for Carnival Time at USC, but I was doing that residency at TAPS Art Center, and it's all been on hold. Once because they had to shut it down on Main Street, and some people may have come last year because the county did, sponsor a hospitality grant for a show. But we're trying to find a location right now. The arts are hurting, the artists and the arts. I mean, that's musicians as well as artists because of the social distancing and places haven't been open. They're starting to reopen galleries. So right now we're just trying to go with the flow. I'm working hard to get a studio permanent as well as temporary to finish pieces, because I literally put a lot of pieces because I started doing not only my reverse glass, but installations with fabric and sewing and a whole crew of people and big sculptures and things like that for TAPS. And we had to put it in storage, but it's coming soon. And hopefully, I don't know where we're going to have it. TAPS is still trying to figure it out because they have a smaller space now. TAPS Outpost is in 5 Points, but there are other locations and there are other avenues. I did have a big show in Florence before COVID at the library, and there's a lot of pieces there, but they're closed and the show is closed. But we're continuing to look for space, and yes, I will be doing, because I have to complete this series, at least get the majority of it closed and try to figure out where we're going to do it in Columbia. I am on Instagram though, JRenee Art. JRenee Art is on Instagram, and you can follow me there. We'll have some stuff posted when the new show comes.
Thank you, JRenee. That was actually another question. Do you mind repeating the contact information one more time so that people can actually maybe write it down or follow you?
Yeah, it's JRenee. I think it's JRenee Art. Oh my goodness, my doors. It's JRenee Art at Instagram.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. We have another question that's just asking what you know about your own cultural background and if you know of any French ancestors in your history.
Well, it's really interesting because the French side in my family doesn't really come from New Orleans. I mean, I'm still investigating my dad's side. The French side comes from my mother's side, which comes from South Carolina, and that is really bizarre. We actually, because my mother's maiden name is French, it's Bartel, and we have the whole entire French family in a Bible. My cousin is trying to Xerox some of them because it's finding the people who have all the information with the elders passing sometimes is difficult. But the whole family that came over from France, we have all of their names. And then it's like, you know how they have the Bible, it's like, oh, they mixed with the African here and the African there. So I'm trying to figure out through maybe ancestry.com or some kind of genealogy, you know, were they on some plantation? Because I know the plantations that we were on my grandmother's side. This is on my grandfather's side. So that's really interesting that somebody asked that, because a lot of people never ask. And I said, well, I don't even know, you know, like, where did they have a plantation? Where the, like, we have the name of the Africans that they, you know, mixed with, but I don't know. I'm assuming they were slaves, but I don't know all the details. And that's one of the things I have to find out. I know more about my grandmother's side, and basically there was no French on that side at all. So it was more Indian, like Cherokee Indian, and slave and African blood. And I'm trying to figure out where in Africa. You know, one of my, actually from my grandmother, my great grandmother was the first free person of color in the family. And she was one of 9 kids, and she was the only one to write all the ancestry down from her grandmother and her mother, who her mother was a slave. So I traced the 3 different plantations we came from, and we can go to 1798 from the Davis plantation in the Marion Davis area. So I have a lot of stories that I wrote down from her, and lots of pictures and lots of information. But yeah, the French side, and my father may have French side, because on his side, my great grandmother and great great grandmother were born in Algiers. And I know that a lot of the slaves came to Algiers first before they were transferred to New Orleans for auction. So I'm getting that information too, but we're concentrating on the South Carolina side right now.
Awesome, thank you. So we have a few questions left. So this question mentions, how does being physically distant from New Orleans affect your art and your artistic sensibility?
Okay. How does it affect my art? Well, a lot of times you'll see what I find, like right now for me, there's 2 pieces I'm doing, because right now in New Orleans, I'm focusing on, I mean, not New Orleans, in South Carolina, I'm focusing on the bottle trees, which is very interesting, because studying the bottle trees, it was kind of an accident. I was doing wanted to do these bottles more related to the Haitians, because they decorate the bottles, and I was going to do reverse glass paintings in them. And then I found out about the hate trees. And I found that in the Carolinas, North and South, but all throughout the South, that those bottles that hang on the gates and on the bottle trees were catching the ghost, or what haints are ghosts. So they come from the Congo. And I researched, because I said, well, they said the slaves talked to me. I saw these folk tales and folk stories, and I was reading all this information about them. And then I found out, I said, well, this had to come from somewhere. And then I found out through research that they came from the Congo. And I thought that was interesting, that my mother's side is from South Carolina and my father's side is from New Orleans, Mississippi, and up and Tennessee. But both were major port cities, and both have a direct tie to the Congo. And so that's the new series that I'm doing, and I'm doing these jazz pieces, but it has been so hard to find broken down jazz musician, and like horns. I can get guitars and banjos and all kinds of stuff in South Carolina, but the horn, it's been a very hard time finding them, because they're like, you know, you see kids that in other cities, they have dribbling the basketball. In New Orleans, we have horns. You see kids walking down the street playing horn instruments. So you can find them a dime a dozen, but here it's been difficult to create those pieces. But I am doing some whimsical art pieces that deal with the hate trees, and they're going to have real instruments in them. So that's part of my influence. I hope I answered the question. Thank you for that.
You did, thank you. So our last question is, if you're comfortable sharing, how do you feel gender plays a part in the way that you navigate or interpret your identity as a New Orleanian?
My gender being a woman. If anyone sees well, you saw the work. There's a lot of women images in there. And I always feel that whether it's in New Orleans or anyway, that the woman holds it down. Okay. We give birth, throughout slavery. We took the brunt of having to deal with, you know, our children leaving and still holding strong and steady. And for me, I always wanted male and women. I didn't really matter what color. I wanted people to see through me this beautiful images of people of color, and especially women. I want them to feel good when they see the pieces. Even if you see something that's disturbing, like to me, some of the hurricane pieces could be disturbing, but I want you to feel a sense of, oh my God, there's something strong and beautiful inside and outside. Because, you know, we have so many images sometimes that have been portrayed of us that were not flattering. And yeah, I want them to be strong, but I also want people to feel like, wow, you know, I can connect to this. Any woman, but I want the strength, you know. I hope I answered the question.
You did. Thank you so much.
I've had a lot of powerful women around me and men, but mostly women, and they've lived longer than men. All the women, even my grandmother, they've lived to 100. So I've had that as an inspiration. Amber, I don't know if she has anything to add.
I'll just add that I constantly like identify myself as a Black woman, and I get like the question a lot of like, what are you? People like questioning my identity a lot. Usually like the race, not so much the gender, and so I always double down and say New Orleans, if anything, because that's where I feel most grounded. But I'm gonna go ahead and pass it off to Dr. Simmons since we're coming to the end of the event now.
I know this has been wonderful. This has been wonderful. I know. I wish we had the clapping kind of emoji to do. We could all do this. This has been absolutely wonderful. We're up on the time. The event, the presentation tonight was recorded, and so we'll be able to link it to our website and also put it on our Facebook page and send it out. And thank you all for attending. Thanks to JRenee, thanks to Amber, thanks to Latasha, Betty, and Chelsea, our Institute team, and the Microsoft Teams Live support team tonight. Thank y'all so very much. We really appreciate you being here. It's a wonderful and important discussion to have. And JRenee, your artwork is just absolutely beautiful and just so inspiring. And so we're looking forward to more of your work and having you, participate in other kinds of events with us. So thank y'all so very much. All right. Good night. Take care.